Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. I'm Jim Ketterer, and I am the director of the BARD Globalization and International Affairs program. A little bit of housekeeping. I just want to remind everyone to turn off their cell phones, to be fully engaged in the event that's about to happen, and then you can catch up with the world in an hour when you turn them back on. I also want to explain what the BARD Globalization International Affairs program is. We have students who come here to New York City every semester, and during the summers, we have the students here who are interning at various organizations around the city and taking courses, BARD college courses in international affairs. We do these lecture series once a month. It's the James Clark Chase Memorial Lecture Series, named after James Chase, who was the editor of the World Policy Journal, Foreign Affairs, was a BARD professor, and the founder of the BGIA program. So in his memory, we do these lectures, and once every semester, we do them in partnership with the Carnegie Council. So we're so happy to be back here. We want to thank Joel Rosenthal, the president of the Carnegie Council, and all of the staff here who are such wonderful partners with us and hosts for these great events. I should also note that this event is supported by Foreign Affairs, as are all of our events at BGIA. And you can go to our website and find out about all the many other great things that we're doing, events and otherwise. I also want to remind everyone that when the formal program ends at 7, we will adjourn to the reception up here, where there also will be books for sale and for signature. So as soon as we wrap up here, just go up there and we'll continue the conversation, and you can get the books, and we can move, and I think there'll be wine too. So very important. Well, we're very happy to have with us tonight Professor Timothy Snyder, who is the Levin Professor of History at Yale and a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. And he will be in conversation with Smita Narula, who is a distinguished lecturer at Hunter College and the director of the Human Rights Program at the Roosevelt House. So without further ado, I turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jim, and good evening, everyone. So I'd like to start by just saying something about the book, which I have in my hand right here. If you have not had a chance to pick it up, I highly recommend you do so, including immediately after the event, or you can even listen to it on Audible. And I understand, Tim, that you do your own narration for your audiobooks. Is that right?
That's true.
I've had the pleasure of both listening and reading to this book, and Tim has a wonderfully soothing voice, even as portions of his book are quite chilling and unsettling. So the book, for those of you who are still unfamiliar with it, is a New York Times bestseller, and it explores the new threats faced by our political order and how we can look back to the 20th century for lessons on how to overcome these threats. 20 lessons in particular on how we can resist the decline into tyranny, drawn from our author's vast body of work on how the Europeans of the 20th century yielded democracy to fascism, Nazism, or communism. So, Tim, I think it's fair to say that this book is a departure from your previous publications, all compelling, thought-provoking books that take a deep dive into war, genocide, and the descent into dictatorship in the mid-20th century. But here, we have an almost pocket-sized book, a manifesto, if you will, but not a manifesto for a political party or an institution or an organization, but for everyday citizens interested in defending our democracy from what you describe as profound threats to our political order. Tell us what led you to write this book in this style, and why now?
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. It's a beautiful night out in New York, and it's the kind of spring-like day which might have filled you with hope. And instead, you chose to come to listen to me and Smita talk about tyranny in the USA. So I'm grateful for your presence and for your priorities. The book is a departure, but it's also an arrival. It's the first thing that I've ever really done as an American. I'm an American, of course, but my work has been on, as you kindly remember, has been on the 20th century in Eastern and Central Europe. And what happened is that some of the things I think I knew, or some of the things which were familiar to me from my historical work, suddenly seemed to appear in my home. One way to think about it is the it, right? The question, it can happen here, can it happen here? Which the answer is always yes, by the way. The answer to that is never no, right? But for me, I took for granted, having written about Nazi and Soviet terror in places and times not so different from our own, where the perpetrators and the victims and the bystanders were people not so very different from us. In some cases, they were our relatives, right? I took it for granted that the it could happen. And I took for granted that the it could happen to people like us because my teachers, when I became a historian of Eastern Europe, were people who had survived the Holocaust or had lived through communism, or in the case of my doctoral supervisor, both. And that's people like us. Our teachers are people like us. If he can teach me and I can have a conversation with all of you, that's people like us. And I think the third thing which was happening was that as a teacher of people who work on East European history, I was confronted with a younger generation from Eastern Europe, Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Hungarians, who have been dealing with the things that we're dealing with now basically for their whole lives as adults. So many of the lessons that are in this book are from the experiences of people in their 20s who have seen after 1989, after that moment when history was supposed to be over and freedom was supposed to be easy and democracy was supposed to come automatically with capitalism and all that nonsense, who have seen rather democracy move away from them, their entire politically aware lives. So that's the third thing. So it can happen, it happens to people like us, and then it's happening now, right? So I came to all of this looking at it from Eastern Europe historically, politically, contemporarily, and I recognized certain patterns in the Trump campaign. And so when he won, my first reaction was to try to translate what I thought I knew into recommendations about what we all can do.
You don't call the president by name in any part of the book. Can you? Testing. You don't call the president by name in any part of the book. What was behind that decision?
Well, there are a couple things. The first is he had been elected, right? He had been elected when I wrote the book. I wrote the book in December of 2016. I wrote the lessons in the hours and days after he won in November of 2016. And in that sense, it wasn't about him. I mean, there's a way in which, many ways in which, focusing on him allows us to dodge the problem. Mm-hmm. So if we say he is an aberration of the system, or if we say he's mentally ill, or if we say he's a historical blip, if we say any of these things, what we're doing is we're abrogating our own responsibility. I mean, both for the fact that he got elected in the first place, but also for how we have to react. Mm-hmm. So the point of the book, the reason it was so fast and so short, and also in a way so direct, was that I was trying to get us to act quickly while there was still time. Mm-hmm. If we spent all of our time trying to decide which way Mr. Trump is mentally ill, or exactly which form of racist oligarchy was going to be established, if we spent all of our time on that, waiting and analyzing, we were going to miss the moment which was politically relevant. So the book is not about him. It's prompted by him. It's prompted by things that he did. It's prompted by things like his urging his supporters to murder his rival. It's prompted by things like the violent character of his allies. It's prompted by the way he uses the English language. It's prompted by him. But it's not about him. It's about us. It's about what the American Republic could be if it were defended.
So I wanted to segue from that, just going right into the first lesson of the book and to really make this about us. Lesson 1, do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. What I hear you essentially saying is do not consent to your own oppression, which is, I suppose, easy to say, but profoundly difficult to do.
Yeah, that's a lot of that's good. A lot of the things in this book sound very easy, and some of them are in fact easy, but a lot of them are harder than they sound. And there's a reason why lesson number 1, don't obey in advance, is lesson number 1, and that is that it's actually difficult And if you fail lesson number 1, lessons 2 through 20 are irrelevant to you because you will never get there. Lesson number 1 requires you as an individual to do something which is unusual, which is to say, I as an individual define this situation as exceptional. I am drawing a line around myself and saying I am not going to act according to what's happening around me, but according to something which is within me. That is hard. People think they're free. Freedom is hard. And freedom is doing the thing that everyone else is not doing, right? It's not saying, I'm free, I live in a free country, yada, yada. Freedom is that moment where you lean out and you're doing the things that other people aren't doing. And that's lesson 1. And it's where it comes from is the study of Nazi Germany. So one of the few things that historians of Nazi Germany agree about, because they're a disagreeable bunch in general, but one of the few things they agree about is that that Hitler gained much of his power by consent, right? That especially in 33 and into the early 34, the regime was possible because people allowed it to happen, because people normalized what was going on around them. That's one of the few things we think we understand historically. Psychologically, the way it works is that we have a very strong tendency to follow rules, right? I mean, we're all following rules right now. Smita's asking questions, I'm answering them, you're sitting, you're not square dancing. Usually, except for those people in the back, usually we do what's expected of us, and usually that's appropriate. And the reason why this is psychologically hard is you have to say, I'm an individual, I'm actually going to break these norms that I'm feeling around me. And the other reason it's important is morally, to use an old-fashioned word, it's morally important because if you do obey in advance, not only do you help authoritarians come to power, but you become the person who helped them come to power, which means that for the rest of your life, you explain why it was that you had to do that. You become the person who makes the excuse for that person who obeyed in advance. And that's a phenomenon which is already, by the way, massive in American society 1 year on.
That's making me think about what will I say to my children 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, my grandchildren, about what I did in this moment. And that's what you're asking us to think about now. The second lesson you go straight into is to defend institutions. Institutions do not protect themselves, you say. So choose an institution you care about and take its side. Which of our institutions do you feel are either most vulnerable or most under attack? And are there any institutions that we need to transform instead of defend?
Yeah, great. So, I mean, let me say just a word about why this is number 2, because there is a kind of logic to it. The institutions have to be defended because individually we're hopeless. One of the great American myths is that freedom means that you're that last person, like on a blasted heath somewhere, holding the automatic weapon and defeating the aliens, and that's freedom, right? Or to be more serious, give a more serious example from our culture. Holocaust movies are always about rescue, and it's always about the unusual person who carries out the rescue. And I work on the Holocaust, this is what I do, and it's true that there were some unusual people who, as individuals, saved other individuals, but in fact what mattered was institutions. In fact, what matters was whether institutions were preserved or whether they were destroyed. That's what determined whether Jews survived or not. So institutions are magnifiers. Institutions are what allow us to be decent. They're what allow us to feel like we're not alone. Because if power actually gets you alone, then you're hopeless. And we love that photo of Tiananmen Square with the lone person holding back the tank, but he didn't actually hold back the tank, right? It's a beautiful image, but that's not how freedom actually works. So we can disagree about which institutions matter most, but there has to be some way of getting us together, and also there have to be some agreed upon ways which limit the power of the government. So in terms of what's most threatened, I would say the fundamental institution which is most threatened, this comes later in the book, but it's factuality, which is like a pre-institution. Factuality, which is the realm of journalists and the realm of scholars like us, the realm of a lot of different people. That's the institution which allows all other institutions. Because if we don't believe there's truth in the world, if we don't believe there are facts, we can't cooperate. And then institutions become impossible. So, to be specific, journalists are under threat. There are institutions also which aren't under threat, but which just don't work, like checks and balances. I mean, it hasn't actually worked out that well, right? I mean, I'm all in favor of it, but unfortunately in this country we have, in the best, on our good days, we have a two-party system rather than checks and balances system. So if the same party is in Congress as has the White House, you can't really expect very many checks and balances, and we're not getting them. So the Congress hasn't failed, but it also isn't, it's not restraining the president very, very effectively. And then I absolutely agree, though, with the premise of your question. There are institutions that have to be renewed. This is a book about treading water. Like, this is a book about how not to drown. This is a book about keeping the American Republic going, which I think is actually the correct way to frame the issue. The idea of the book is that if we practice some of the things that it recommends, then we would be better citizens and better able to form new institutions at the end. I think the institutions that need to be formed are largely the small ones. And it's heartening to see people doing that, whether it's the lawyers, a lot of them here in New York, getting together in NGOs, whether it's indivisible across the country, whether it's small groups helping other people run for state office. It's the small things which have to be revived, I think.
And a lot of your, I think what I found incredibly compelling about the book, both chilling, the book to me was both very chilling and also very empowering, right? Chilling because you bring the weight and this depth of knowledge of history to bear and ask us to have an active relationship with history as we see our own history develop before us today. And that can feel very weighty, it can feel very chilling, yet you also call on us to engage in small, everyday acts, making eye contact and small talk, putting away our screens and enjoying a long read. And lesson 13, practice corporeal politics. Power wants your body softening in your chair and your emotions dissipating on the screen. Get outside, put your body in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar people, make new friends and march with them. Could you say something about the transformative potential of small acts?
That's in a way what the book is all about. It's about the small acts which seem easy, but which in fact require a tiny bit of courage, and then the magnification effect that a tiny bit of courage on your part has for other people. So many of the lessons, some of you have already mentioned, are about very simple things, like, for example, do you go outside or not, right? Do you just get angry over Facebook, or do you actually march? That, for me, is a really fundamental difference. And it's a choice, because Facebook actually takes up the energy that you need for marching. Or even worse, it makes you feel like you've done something when at the end of the day you actually haven't. You feel tired and dissipated, and you're just dissipated. So that decision to go out and put your body in a new place changes the way you think, and it means that you end up meeting people that you wouldn't have met otherwise, which is generally not true of the internet. It also has this interesting quality that you might actually persuade someone. Not that that's easy. I mean, I feel like we've gotten to this point in America where everyone thinks we can't persuade anyone of anything else because we're all completely, we're in our own silos. But it's hard, but it's actually possible in real life. It's not possible with the internet, right? The Facebook exchange, which ends with someone writing, you have persuaded me with your rational arguments. That Facebook exchange has yet to happen. Even though I've been making this joke for like 2 years now, it still hasn't happened, and it won't. But when you actually talk to people in real life, like you talk to people who are a bit different, and they talk to people a bit different, and there's some chance that will make a difference. So little things like getting your body out and the making eye contact, I think is really, it's interesting. That's the lesson that has inspired the most questions in the years since I've written this book. Precisely that one, and it's, in a way, it gets to the essence of one of the things about this book, which is that it's about not sleepwalking, right? It's what you said about history. I mean, history, if we take history seriously, we can't sleepwalk. If we take history seriously, we realize these things are possible. We're partaking in them. We're either making them more or less possible with everything that we do all the time. And therefore, if we sleepwalk, we're making them more possible. There's no exit. Right? History is existential that way. And so every little thing has an effect outside of you, but it also has an effect on how you comport yourself, has an effect on yourself, longitudinally over time.
So I expect you all to be making eye contact at the reception afterwards. I want to come back to your point about courage and coming to lesson 8, which is stand out. Someone has to. It is easy to follow along. It can feel strange to do or say something different, but without that unease, there is no freedom. Remember Rosa Parks, the moment you set an example, the spell of the status quo is broken and others will follow. my question stemming from that is, I have found that the burden of action is often carried by those who have the most to lose. Yet it could be argued that the moral responsibility of taking action should be borne by those who have unjustly gained or who have been unjustly enriched by the status quo. But your book speaks uniformly to all readers. Do you think some bear more moral responsibility than others to take the actions that are described in your book?
That's going to be a yes, but. So absolutely, there are people who bear greater responsibility for the calamity that we're in now, and some of them are not in the United States. The practical question is, how does one actually get those people to acknowledge the responsibility that they bear? And one way to characterize, I think, the fix that we're in, and I'm sorry I have my back turned to you the whole time, one way to characterize the fix that we're in is that we're in a crisis of responsibility, where precisely the people who have power are the ones who talk about how they can't do anything. I mean, in the extreme is actually the President of the United States, who is the executive of the most powerful country in the world, and yet he's hopeless in reacting to something as basic as a cyber attack on the United States. And all he can say about it is, well, you can't prove that I was right in the middle of it, right? As opposed to, I'm going to defend my country, or I'm going to take responsibility for the good of my country. I mean, that's an extreme example, but in general, the way that he does the presidency is to make it into a kind of game where nothing is ever possibly his fault. And that's a big part of our culture, and it's a big part of the problem. So I agree with the premise, and I worry a lot about how President Trump sets an example for people like himself. I worry a lot about the demography. I worry a lot about a group who might have been a little bit more decent and now are less decent because of the way he behaves. People who maybe don't identify with him but see him as in some way normal, right? But I agree with the premise, and yet it's going to be people. It's going to be the people who see things faster are often the people who aren't the ones who are privileged, right? Mm-hmm. And the people who do things first are often not the people who are privileged. I mean, the way, unfortunately, there's a racial element to this as well. I mean, you can go after me about this in Q&A, but it tends to be the white males who are slower to see just how egregious this is, right? And they, of course, bear, in terms of the voting, the greatest responsibility for where we are. So yes, that would be good, but I'm not going to wait for that, though.
You know, that leads me to another question, which is about protest, and coming off of the question of privilege and protest. You said, and in the book, and you've just said now, it can be organized on social media, but nothing gets real until it hits the streets. But not all protesters are treated equally, and in fact, the state's response to protest can be very racialized, and we've seen that, right? We've seen very disparate responses to protests depending on who's protesting. When white supremacists are allowed to walk freely brandishing guns and tiki torches, but peaceful Native American protesters or Black activists are deemed Black identity extremists or pelted out with rubber bullets and tear gas and arbitrary arrests, it makes the call to protest carry this very heavy weight and burden. And I just was wondering if you could say more about the burden of protest and sort of the racialized response to it.
No, I completely agree with you. And you could push the question a bit further and point to the difference between citizens and non-citizens. Yep. So non-citizens who protest in this country are acting from a different kind of courage than citizens, because they have things to lose. They can, in some cases, have been deported. So yeah, I agree with that completely. And it goes back to the corporeal politics. What I'm saying, in a way, you captured in a way very well what I'm trying to say to people who might think, I don't have to protest yet. One of the reasons you have to protest now, if you're in a relatively privileged position, is that for other people, it's already harder than it is for you, and your presence on the streets will change the nature of the protest. I mean, this is an old logic, but everybody knows it. If you wait until you feel you really have to protest, the game is already over. The game is already over. So you have to get out and do it first, partly for precisely this reason, so that it's harder to characterize it as being just some Americans and not all Americans. And pragmatically speaking, so that police react differently to protest. So I think that it's really important for protests to be big, to be bigger than they are. And it's really important to always protest earlier than you think you have to. And this is true for everyone. I mean, this is such a good question, because what happens, what has already happened in Eastern Europe and what happened in the 30s and 40s is that people wait to protest. They think, the privileged people in your categorization, they think I can always protest. But that's not true, right? It can be criminalized, right? Ask the Russians. You can get to a point where it's illegal, and then the nice law-abiding people will generally not protest at all, and then the game's over. So.
And it is being criminalized
Yeah.
in various states. So I wanted to step back from the specific lessons and pull back a little bit to the premise of the book, which is that we're facing new threats to the political order. I have, in my own conversations about these issues and in my own work as a human rights scholar and defender, encountered two distinct schools of thought. So one is that the current administration is a dramatic, radical departure from what has come before it. And the second is to see it as a natural extension or logical extension or natural culmination of long-standing processes, namely deepening economic inequality, the corporate capture of our democracy, which you also talk about, and of course our long and undeniable history of upholding racism and defending white supremacy. So my question is, are these threats to the political order in fact new? Or are they the results of long-standing processes, or does it depend on who you ask?
Well, I'm going to punt a little bit and say both. I mean, the important thing for me is that we are able to recognize a moment when we do things or when we ought to do things that we wouldn't have done a moment before. And I'm very sympathetic, and I agree with my African-American friends and colleagues who say, this is just the same thing, but maybe turned in a slightly different direction so that you've happened to notice it, right? I'm very sympathetic to that point. But in political terms, and this is a political book, we need to be able to agree, as many of us as possible, that this is a moment where we need to do something. We need to do something. Now, let me try to answer the question by saying I think there's some things here that are new, but I think some of the best ways to fight them is by remembering the old, right? I mean, so the whole method of this book is not to say Tim Snyder understands the 20th century. The whole method of this book is to say Victor Klemperer or Václav Havel or other people who experienced moments that were in some way like ours left us interesting things to think with. And I think those things still work. In fact, I think I'm seeing them work among some Americans in 2018. But I think there are some new things or some things which we haven't seen for a while. One of them is economic inequality on this scale. So we've now reached a point where the top decile in America owns about 78% of the wealth, whereas we're getting up to the Russian standard, which is 87%. If we measure the wealth that the top 0.1% of Americans owned, we've now reached where we were in 1929. This is extremely significant. I think it's quite significant that, and you know all this, but I'll mention it anyway, it's quite significant that for 90% of the American population, there's been no positive change in wealth or income since 1980, which basically means we've produced a couple of generations now where this idea of social advancement or the American dream isn't there. That is an explanation. That is something which it's crept up on us, but that is an explanation for Mr. Trump and in general for a kind of politics which, rather than promising something in the future, only promises the past, right? Another thing which is new is the internet, right? And it's new basically in a bad way. I mean, I'm happy to discuss this back and forth, but I think basically a bad thing. I mean, all told, basically a bad thing, at least in politics, basically a bad thing. Havel and Klemperer didn't have to deal with the internet. It's now possible to reach more quickly to more people's most basic anxieties, fears, and prejudices than it was before. And it's more possible with modern forms of propaganda to tailor your message to what you think people will already want to hear. So there is something new, I think, about the contradictory character of a lot of propaganda, right? The Russians, for example, have no problem, and they did this in Ukraine and they did this to us, in saying, for example, in Ukraine they're all fascists, demography, and then to another demography saying all of the Ukrainian state was created by the international Jewish conspiracy, right? They have no problem with that because they're targeting the message. Likewise with us, they have no problem saying to blacks, you should defend yourselves and you should buy guns, and saying to whites, you should defend yourselves and you should buy guns, right? They have no problem being completely contradictory because unlike old school propaganda, they have the technical tools to target particular groups and just and push them off in a certain direction. I think that's new, and it's not just them; they're just better at it than we are. But the American right does that now, as well. I mean, you see it after the school shootings in Florida, for example. This is what happens. And then the other thing, which I think is slightly new, although it happened with fascism too, is that the far right is now much more internationalist than the far left. They learn from each other, right? So when Russia invades Ukraine, the flag which is used for the pseudo-state in southeastern Ukraine under Russian occupation is the Confederate battle flag, just to take an example.
What I think is, one of the things that I think is so profound about the book and the contribution that it's already made is this idea of not only of taking personal responsibility and the call to action now, but to do things that are transformative also of your surroundings. So you talk about taking care of the face of the world, pulling down the symbols of hate, not walking by a swastika and just saying, well, that's up now, but taking it down, or listening for dangerous words and really being critical in your thinking about how words like terrorism and extremism are being used and who they're being applied to and why. And I just was thinking maybe you could say a little bit more about that, because I think one of the things that really struck me in your descriptions of Europe and the rise of fascism or Nazism there is just the incredible normalization of the daily march of dehumanization that takes place. And it takes place in this very almost banal way today in such an onslaught of what's on the media and what comes to us that we can just simply walk by it until it becomes the new normal. Can you speak to that?
I mean, as a student of the Holocaust, one of the things that really worries me, troubles me about American discourse, about the Second World War and Hitler, is that people tend to say, well, look, we haven't killed 6 million Jews, therefore everything is fine, right? No, essentially, like if you haven't gotten all the way to the end of the Holocaust, then nothing has happened, which ignores that to get from 1933 to 1945, a whole lot of things had to happen in a certain order. We're not in 1941, but we're kind of in 1933. And in 1933, what matters is what you're talking about, Smita, which is the semiotics, the signs, the symbols, the public sphere. This is another thing which historians of Nazi Germany also agree about. I'm going to run out of the list pretty quickly, but another thing that we agree about is that the swastikas that were painted on the walls or the Stars of David that were used to mark Jewish shops were incredibly important. That when these are the things that actually enabled the regime to change. Because as you say, they instructed people what they were supposed to normalize. And this is one thing which really is a lesson that can be learned. Because at the beginning, the people who were painting the swastikas and the Stars of David, those were private initiatives, right? The SS was an NGO. No, it was. The SS was part of the Nazi Party. I mean, later it's merged with the police, and it's the main instrument of the Holocaust. And I don't mean to make light of it, but those were citizens doing one thing. One thing that Americans have done better than Germans in 1933 is that they've been more aware of their surroundings. So there are NGOs in the United States, in this city, for example, who get up early in the morning and paint over swastikas. This matters. It matters so much. It matters to all the people who don't see the swastika that day, and not just the Jews, everybody. But it also matters to the people who do the painting, because it's a very nice example of a little thing that you can do, and it's weird, right? It's maybe weird. It's maybe illegal sometimes to to paint, but doing that little thing is liberatory.
And I think it also is happening, and I think much of what these processes have enabled are the surfacing of conversations that are sometimes uncomfortable but so necessary to have, and also looking back at more historic symbols like Confederate statues or Confederate flags, or even just a few blocks away from here, the question of whether Christopher Columbus's statue should be standing in the middle of Columbus Circle. And I think very recently there was a decision to keep the statue there, but to add a plaque to it, to add some context. So it's not just the new symbols that are appearing or the old ones that are reappearing, but going back to our collective history and our collective understanding of what is our history and questioning that as well. Would you say that that's part of the process?
Absolutely. No, the new encounters with time and in the past are happening in lots of different dimensions. Some of the conversations that I've had have been with Holocaust survivors, that is the ones who are still with us. I'm over and over again, I mean, I know some of these people because of my work, but some of them I don't. They write me and they say, this reminds me of X. And then children and grandchildren also, this reminds me of the thing that my mother, my grandmother mentioned, right? Like that's a historical conversation, which I was not expecting to be having. I just thought I would mention that. With the 1930s, there's another thing I would say. We in America need to remember that in the 1930s, we got lucky, right? We got lucky. We had good leadership in the 1930s. It made a difference that we started to build a welfare state. It made a difference that we entered the Second World War. Neither of those things was necessary. It's possibly both of them were unlikely, but they happened and it made a great deal of difference. In the 1930s, the American attitudes about race, or the American attitudes about Jews for that matter, were perfectly in the European mainstream, right? We were not better than all those Lithuanians and Latvians who we find it so easy to criticize now, right? The Baltic states actually took more Jews than we did, not even as just a matter of population. So, I mean, before the Holocaust. So we have a certain tendency to say, this is a very American thing, the city on the hill, that evil happened over there and we were over here being good. No, we were over here making the same anti-Semitic arguments about why we couldn't take refugees that everyone else was in the 1930s. And that's like, and we don't confront that. More broadly, we don't confront how politics in the 1930s in Europe, I mean, you probably all know this, but how close it was to politics in the 1930s in Europe and how popular fascist ideas were here, right? You could get 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden, not just for a far-right rally, but for a Nazi rally in New York City, of all places. So when I'm getting to the Confederate statues because we have to remember that when we say America first, right, or when our president says America first, that is a reference back, a positive reference back to an alternative America, right, where we remained isolationist, racist, where we didn't do anything for the world, right, where we remained in that far-right mainstream of the time. That's what America first means. America first meant opposition to the welfare state, opposition to involvement abroad, and in general, it meant keep the refugees out. That's an alternative America which almost happened. I mean, Philip Roth's novel about this, The Plot Against America, is very good. It's possible that novel is more likely than what actually happened. And we have to be humble about the 1930s. Okay, I'm getting to the statues because the statues, as you probably all know, don't have anything to do with the Civil War. That is, they don't arise organically from the Civil War. The statues are monuments to the ethnic cleansing or the racial purging of African Americans from the center of American cities. That's what they are. That's what they stand for. That's what they were meant to communicate to African Americans, and that's what they do communicate to African Americans. Monuments aren't history in the sense that they somehow permanently represent something. They're history in the sense that they arose in particular historical circumstances, and then historians get very unpopular when we explain what those circumstances actually were. And I'm not going to talk about every statue in New York because, I'm from Connecticut. Right? But I'll make a general point, which is, I'm actually from Ohio. I'll make a general point, which is that one thing which history really shows is that statues change all the time. They change all the time. The argument that we have to have a statue today because we had one yesterday, that's historically false. They change all the time. And so the question is, do you think about it critically or do you think about it uncritically? Because they're going to change.
So I'm going to get one more question, and then I'm going to open it up because I'm sure there's many questions in the audience. I'm going to ask you to look back and then help move us forward. So looking back, elsewhere you've said, I'm a skeptic. My tendency is to look at examples from other places and to ask what we could learn. The point of using the historical examples is to remind ourselves that democracies and republics usually fail. the expectation should be failure rather than success. This book was published in February 2017, is that correct? And a lot has happened since then. Looking back on this year, are we failing or is the resistance strong?
B minus. B minus, and since there's a lot of grade inflation at Yale. I'm sure there isn't at Bard, but like at Yale, it's kind of a problem. I would B minus. So, I mean, in terms of what's happened, I would like to think that a lot of the things I warned about from Mr. Trump have actually come true. I wish I had been wrong about those things, but just so that that's on the record, he has actually embodied a complete disregard for most of the unwritten conventions and a lot of the written rules of the way America is supposed to work. He has actually turned out to be the perhaps unwitting, but almost certainly witting pawn of a foreign power. It has turned out to be the case that we Americans were not really ready for this sort of thing, most of us. Now, on the other hand, some of the institutions have done really well. So my heroes are the reporters. My heroes are the investigative journalists. Without them, we don't have a clue, right? Without them, Mueller doesn't have a clue. Without them, Mueller doesn't know where to begin. Also, without investigative reporters, we don't have the Panama Papers, we don't have the Paradise Papers, we don't have a sense of just how unequal our countries have become. We don't know that $7 to $21 trillion has been offshored, right? Without the reporters. The reporters are giving us the chance, basically. Or to put it a different way, without them, we have no chance. If this had happened in some world without The Guardian and without The Washington Post and without The New York Times, without the 2,000 or so investigative reporters, which is not very many, right? If it happened in that world, we would already be done with. And Trump knows this, right? He's a skillful politician in many ways. And his instinct that the reporters are a problem is correct, because the reporters keep the factual world going. So a lot of them have done really well. I would say this is a heroic age. I think that people are going to look back and say this was a heroic age of investigative reporting. And the lawyers have done, not all of them, right? I mean, like one of them perjured himself to become attorney general. But the lawyers, yeah, he perjured himself, right, to become the highest law official in the land. It's extraordinary, but it's not like it doesn't rise to the top. But the lawyers have done really well, which is sensitive for me because in Germany in the 30s, the lawyers flipped. They flipped. I mean, they found ways, in a very proud legal tradition, they found ways of justifying what was happening. And many of the commanders, most of the commanders of the Einsatzkommandos who carried out the beginning of the Holocaust and other atrocities in 1941 were lawyers, were people with law degrees. So that's one that I'm sensitive about. And a lot of American lawyers have done very good things. There aren't enough people. There are a lot of people doing great things. People are running for office. That's hugely important. People are realizing that elections are not just rituals, that you have to win sometimes and you have to take risks sometimes. That's great. I think we're not yet at the point where enough people realize what's at stake.
You know, from my own perspective, doing human rights work, I think the people have done really well.
Good.
And I actually think not only in standing up and coming forward with courage, but bringing themselves into conversations, sometimes very uncomfortable, in very personal, transformative ways. It takes a lot to resist the onslaught of news and information. And I've actually been quite emboldened and impressed by also the solidarity that has been shown between social movements, the role of women and people of color in leading these struggles of undocumented youth, of the youth post the gun shootings who are right now on the streets and in the White House demanding that they be listened to. There's a lot, the pendulum is swinging in one direction, but there's an equal force, I think, that's also pulling people onto the street and away from their screens.
That's wonderful, and that's true. And just a couple of things that really strike me in your closing remark. The first is, in a way, how old-fashioned the individuality is. So when one of those high school kids in Florida actually talks, he gives us a chance, right? He puts him or herself out there. And even though he or she is 17 or 16 or whatever, he or she is going to get slaughtered on social media, right? This is already happening. And of course, being a teenager, they know that, right? And so there's a very old-fashioned way, like this is what the Greeks said, that democracy is only possible if the physical individual person stands out and is present and is recognizable as a person, right?
I think that's a good point on which to open it up to all of you. So, and to say thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you. So we have two mics that have been set up on either side of the aisle. We ask that anybody who would like to ask a question, please line up at the mic. Please do identify yourself, say your name, and please do pose a question and perhaps a brief one so that we can get many questions in. Please.
So, first of all, thank you very, very much. I'm John Hirsch with the International Peace Institute. So at the Munich Security Conference last Saturday, the Polish Prime Minister publicly stated, if I can get his actual remarks, that Jews were perpetrators in the Holocaust as well as Poles. And this is part of their effort to criminalize anybody who criticizes Poland for any role in the Holocaust. So do you have any comment about, here we are in the United States, obviously. What do you think the reaction ought to be? I've seen nothing from the American government.
Yeah, so I'm gonna make a big response to this. This is something I've been thinking about a lot, about democracy. Because one of the things that, like, if we're on the left, you think, well, maybe we shouldn't talk about democracy. Our democracy is flawed. Maybe we shouldn't impose our ideas on everybody else, and so on. And one of the things that I've been noticing is that you either go forward or you go back. There doesn't seem to be that ideal place where you say, we're just going to make our democracy perfect, right? What's happened is that America is rolling back. There's no stable state. There's no point where you can say, well, we're just going to take care of America first. That's actually impossible. What happens is that when you say we're just going to take care of America first, everybody, whether it's the Burmese or the Poles, takes a cue from that. That's what's happened, right? I mean, the mass murder of the Rohingya have something to do with the fact that the State Department no longer takes its own human rights department seriously. I mean, to be fair, the diplomats who do that work do, but the top of the State Department does not, and the President of the United States obviously does not. The fact that the Poles say the things they do and pass the laws that they do has to do with the fact that our own approach to history is anything goes. We have the Chief of Staff of the President talking about the Civil War as being something that should have been worked out among reasonable people. We have the President of the United States saying the same thing, right? We have the President of the United States saying that among Nazis are very fine people, right? I'm happy to criticize the Poles and so on, but we are very important in all of this. The way that we talk, we can't close off the rest of the world. The rest of the world takes its cues from us one way or the other. And now they're taking their cues the other way. So I'm happy to get down into the details about Poland, but I think for us, that's the most important thing.
Thank you. We'll go on this side.
You talk about the need for people to go out and march and demonstrate, be on the streets. Well, a whole lot of students from Broward County traveled for 8 hours to get to Tallahassee, and they demonstrated, and they were on the streets. Yet in this very same day, a majority of Republicans in the Florida legislature voted down a bill to ban assault weapons. Doesn't that point out the fact that the most important thing is to get involved in politics and fight for all these democratic values in the government?
Yeah. I really don't think it's an either or. There are 300 million people in this country. It's going to do a lot of them good if they protest. One of the things about protesting is that it means that you've taken some kind of a stand. You've done something which is relatively easy. Another thing about protest is that it means that you meet people and then you start a neighborhood organization, which may or may not lead to running for office. I don't think it's an either or. I don't think protest makes it less likely that people run for office. I think on the contrary, for a lot of people, it's a first step. If you look for the 20-somethings and 30-somethings who are running for office now and starting to win, a lot of them protested. A lot of them were in this city for the Women's March, right? A lot of them traveled to this city for the Women's March. So I don't think it's an either or. But I want to agree with you. I want to agree with you fundamentally that it's very important that people run for office. It's very important that people realize that districts are winnable. It's very important to realize that you can go out there and you can actually win an election. Yeah, that I agree with completely. I just don't think it's an either or.
First, thanks very much for most fascinating and very helpful, I think, discussion for all of us. I wanted to ask you perhaps a comparison with the 1930s with respect to two institutions or two groups, shall we say. One is the religious institutions of the day here in the US vis-a-vis religious institutions, whether they be in 1930s Germany or in the communist era of Eastern Europe. And the other institution, which is, I suppose, specifically relevant to the fascist era, is business. And I wonder how you would compare and contrast. I tend to think that on both of those scores, what we have today is quite a bit more hopeful, but I am interested to hear your comments.
I think I agree with you. The situations. I mean, my immediate response whenever I get a question like that is to talk about all the ways the 1930s are like today. But I'm going to restrain that impulse, and I'm going to answer your question straight up because I think you're right. So one of the things which is striking about business and National Socialism, it's not that business brought the National Socialists to power. That's not really true. It's not that the businessmen were, for the most part, Nazis. They were generally men of the right, and they did generally partake in the idea that we'll stay on top of this transition. We'll be able to manage this person. But then once they couldn't, then strikingly, they found ways to adapt, and they found ways to profit. I mean, two of the most obvious are taking over Jewish firms and property. Right? We haven't gotten, well, we have in some cases, but when you get to the point where the government starts distributing property from one place to another, it's hard for certain businessmen to resist that. Another even more striking example are the concentration camps, which were business operations. Auschwitz was a place among many other things, it was a site of cheap labor, which important German companies found irresistible. So with religion, I'm going to make a slightly different point, which is that I think there's a discussion always about whether Christianity is a thing you have or Christianity is a set of actions that you perform, let's say. And in this country, I agree with you that it's better, but in this country there is also the trap, very profoundly and visibly so, of saying Christianity is the thing that we are, rather than Christianity is something that you do. There were relatively few examples in Germany itself. Bonhoeffer is the most famous. There are very few examples in Germany itself of Christians saying Christianity is a thing that we do, right? Thus far, it looks a little bit better here on both fronts. With business here, the interesting thing here is that businesses. Let me make another point here about libertarianism, okay? Because there's an idea in America. I'm agreeing with you that it's not as bad, okay? But I can't resist ending on a negative note. There's an idea in America which says freedom is about making it to the top, right? And that's an idea that people find very attractive, even when in other ways they might think that they're on the left, or they might think they're progressive or new or whatever. But that idea that freedom means making it to the top, that's not that many intellectual steps away from social Darwinism, and indeed National Socialism. So when Hitler talked to businessmen, what he said was, you guys have made it to the top. The whole world should be like that. It should just be survival of the fittest, right? That's the language that he spoke to them. I guess what I would suggest now a bit normatively to American business is that, yeah, a lot of firms are doing an awful lot of good things. And there are a lot of really smart, and for that matter, wealthy people who are on the right side of all of this. But we are going to need to have a language which is not a libertarian language of we're free because we made it to the top. That's not going to be enough.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sandra Stein. I'd like to ask you, it seems besides Trump in your face every day with all his repulsive behavior, that this is really very organized. You know, big money has been planning this for a long time at the local state level, redistricting, and the new tax law. I mean, I'd read years ago, once they make enough debt, then they squeeze out all the social programs. Yeah. So it's not willy-nilly. It's very organized by very wealthy people over a long time.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with that. And it speaks to the gentleman's earlier question. The only way to counter people who have a plan is to have a plan. I mean, the only way to win state houses is to win state houses. The only way to fix gerrymandering is to win elections. That's the only real way. I think it's right. I mean, whatever one thinks about the goals, one has to say, I think, with sobriety, that for the last 35 years, the Republicans have been better planners than the Democrats have. And there's a lesson to be, both in terms of ideology and in terms of winning, right? And in terms of actually thinking about questions of power. The Democrats have become a little bit too much a party where they think we're going to win the presidency and then other things will sort themselves out. And then you don't win the presidency and other things don't sort themselves out, even if you do. So I agree with you. I guess I would just add that there is something special about Mr. Trump. He isn't actually a product of these plans that you're talking about. The people who were planning, you know, whether you mean the Koch brothers or someone else, they weren't actually planning for Trump. But and Trump brings some things to the table which are both very special and very risky. His charisma is both very special and very risky. The fact that he's in bed with non-American oligarchs makes him a risky proposition. But for now, I agree with you that he enables a lot of things which have been in the works for a long time to go through. And of course, you're 100% right that having deliberately added $1 trillion to the deficit, they will now say, well, of course we can't afford the basic things in the richest country in the history of the world that are normal in other places. We can't afford those things. That's what they're going to say next. Of course, that's true. Yeah.
I think this is going to be our last question.
Oh, my goodness. Ron Berenbaum. Excuse me. First of all, thank you for your kind word about lawyers. But some lawyers eventually become judges. And the failure of the judiciary was fundamental, I think, to the failure or to the success of the Nazi regime. And it's quite clear, obviously, that Trump wants to populate the federal judiciary and also the Republicans at the local level, the state judiciaries, with people who very much share their point of view. And when they don't, as was the case in Pennsylvania, where the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania ordered that the districts be redrawn, there's now a movement afoot to impeach those justices. So how can we preserve the independence of the judiciary? Is it even possible? And isn't it fundamental in terms to holding our ground against Trump?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a range of answers. None of them is completely satisfactory. The first is that I'm going to be Joe Conservative for a minute here, and I'm going to bemoan the loss of history and the loss of civics in American schools, because the ideal of how checks and balances are supposed to function, the tripartite character of the American federal government as described in the first few articles of the Constitution, people just don't know that. They just don't, and it's worse than it used to be, measurably worse than it used to be. People think that there's a leader. That's a word that I really don't like because, for disciplinary reasons, because it's professional deformation. Because leader means Führer. In Italian, leader is duce, right? In Russian, it's vozhd. These are words that we don't like in other contexts. We don't have a leader. There's no leader in the American Constitution, yet people talk about leaders all the time. a leader is someone who emerges in an exceptional situation and doesn't have to follow the rules. He doesn't need rules, he just needs followers. So I realize this is long-term and organic, but we have to have civics. The Constitution can't just be something that like a certain small elite remembers at the last moment. The second thing is I agree with you that it's fundamental. And I agree with you. And what an interesting thing that I think we're observing is the shift in who cares about, for lack of a better word or cliche, the law and order, right? You simply cannot say that the Republican Party is a law and order party anymore. It's not. They're not a law and order party. If you think it's okay for the sovereignty of the U.S. to be violated, you're not a law and order party. If you think it's okay to interfere in an ongoing FBI investigation, you're not a law and order party. And the actual law and order people, like a lot of them are aware of this. I mean, the ones who are in charge of law and order. So what I'm saying politically is I think that there's room here for someone to say, I mean, not without the nasty implication of law and order, right? But for someone to claim the ground of saying, we are in fact a state where the rule of law matters. We care about the law. Our people care about the law. I think there's politically room for that. But I agree with you that what we're holding on to, or what's holding on to us, the thing that we've still got is that it's the rule of law. And I agree with you that actually having that of our three parts of government, that part is actually doing something, which is not negative. And it's, I mean, with a few qualifications, it's the only part. It's the only part. It's what's keeping us going. And I'm going to say one more thing, just one more thing about the rule of law. There's an argument that ought to be made, I think, to the American right, or at least to American business about the rule of law. And it's this. If you lose the rule of law at the top, right? If you lose the rule of law at the top with respect to presidents, if you allow yourself to slip from being a republic with all of the qualifications about how flawed a republic are, but if you allow yourself to slip from being a republic to an oligarchy, what happens is that a few business people do very well, but most of them are going to do much, much, much worse. The whole economy is going to contract, and it's going to be a few people doing better, but a lot of them doing worse. I feel like no one on the American right, for lack of a better word, is talking about how important the rule of law is for the economy, for this economy that we kind of take for granted. What happens when you move to oligarchy is that the economy shrinks, and that of the vast majority of people, the ones who aren't in the immediate environs of what the Russians call the family, the ones who aren't right around power, they're going to be worse off. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that this argument for law reaches into quarters, or should reach into quarters where it hasn't reached yet.
I also think thank you. And I also think it's a nice sort of reminder to come back to the book on lesson 2.
I regret very much. I would like to ask a question of Professor Snyder that transcends this yay group of general consensus.
Perhaps at the reception you could ask the question.
No,
we
at
do
the
need to wrap
reception
up.
it will not be this forum. And certainly Professor Snyder will be asked by 1,001 people. So that my question will be irrelevant.
If you could keep it extremely
Okay,
brief, because we need
if
to
you
wrap
can
up.
ask it as a question, because in fairness to the other 150 people here, we're now 5 minutes over time.
My question,
yeah.
I think, is more important, but that's all right. One more time, we go yay.
Okay, all right.
I'd like to come back from the last question to just I was very pleased to hear you name that institution. As a human rights lawyer myself, very concerned about what's happening to the judiciary and how it's being weakened. And to come back to one of your lessons to say, pick an institution and defend it. I also think something that the book does, and I'll conclude on this, is that it asks us to sort of look up from our screens, our lives, to get out of this reactive state, which is exactly where authoritarian leaders want us to be, and to choose where we target our focus with laser-like precision, and to go after and defend or transform or whatever needs to be done in a very proactive, profound, and courageous way. And I think that's one of the institutions, but this is a call to all of us, this manifesto you've given, to step out of that reactive place, to claim our power in small ways, in big ways, And I thank you for being here. I thank you for being in conversation with us. I thank you all for choosing to be here tonight to turn your attention with laser-like focus on what needs to be done ahead. And I hope you'll all purchase the book, which is available in the back. And I know that Tim has a new book coming out called The Road to Unfreedom, which I'm sure he'd be happy to talk about in the reception. And my thanks to all of you for being here. And let's carry on. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.